Bien. Buenos días de todos. Good morning to everybody. I'm really pleased to have been invited here because I believe this topic is extremely important. When I was approached by the ACP to give a presentation a few months back, the oil was still around $100 per barrel. I don't know exactly what it is today, but I think we're at 45 or 50 max. What has happened is what some people call the perfect storm. Perfect storm, dropping the oil price in half in less than 6 months. And in January, everybody was talking, well, it's the perfect storm. It's kind of, that's what happened in 2009, isn't it? Now we're actually, later in the year, and we kind of go, when is the perfect storm going to go away? Yeah, we've kind of had enough of that. So really, has there been something which has fundamentally changed in the way we have to think about oil and gas prices for the next 10 years? Now, if we say new thinking, what was the old thinking? So I'm a scientist, I'm data-driven. So what I will be doing today is, and this is the outline of my presentation, we have to see where are actually the resources, the geopolitical environment. What are the elements of the oil price? How does it actually fundamentally work? Everybody in this room understands commodity pricing, but I think it's really good to start to understand how does it fundamentally really work and what is the impact for a country like Colombia? And how good are we at predicting oil prices? I have a surprise for you there. Then we'll be looking at oil price since 1960. Why 1960? Because 1960 OPEC was formed, and it's an important time for that. Uncertainties and predetermined elements affecting oil price. What makes the oil price really move and what has fundamentally changed? I'll end up with some recommendations. We have to look at the world. We cannot just look in isolation for Colombia, for a country. It is definitely a fact, if I can get this to work, yes, that most of the oil resources are actually in the Middle East, Canada, Venezuela, and Russia. By the way, I will not be talking about gas. This is a whole other topic. I will not be talking about coal. I will not be talking about other parts of energies like renewables or nuclear. This is a different topic. Most of the oil is actually focused in this particular area, which is not very stable. I hope you would agree with me about that. Neither is Russia. Venezuela, its own problems, in Canada, the only one really being stable, but extremely heavy oils. So this is where the reserves are. Now, who is actually consuming these hydrocarbons? And that's another slide which shows in gray here, we actually have the amount produced in hydrocarbons, and in orange, the amount consumed. You can very clearly see that there's a total imbalance. Countries who actually require a lot of hydrocarbons, a lot of oil, emerging countries like China, they actually don't have much reserves to produce from. So there is an imbalance in the world from that perspective. Where the oil is, very little is actually produced. A lot is produced and very little is actually used, which is a very important part. So there is an imbalance in the entire system. So how does this actually work? Commodity pricing. So let's reflect a moment of what's actually happening in this particular graph. I think it is quite fundamental. If we look at it from a producer's perspective, the producer has a marginal production cost. He can impact that production cost through efficiency, but he incurs that particular cost. Very often companies actually borrow money to produce, develop, find new hydrocarbons. They have to pay interest on that. There's tax to be paid and dividends to be provided to shareholders. So if we now look on the other side, shareholders, governments, and lenders. So in the case of Colombia, a lot of the dividends are also going to the government. And I think we've heard a lot about how much money is actually required in Colombia for new investments. So this is a fundamental part that actually tax and dividends are paid to the government. If any money is actually left, well, you can grow. Shareholders also would like to see growth. You have to, if you produce hydrocarbons, your reserves diminish. You have your reserves replacement ratio, which diminishes, and that's definitely not a good thing. So you have to invest all the time in growth. because you produce. That's a very particular aspect of this industry. If you have some money left, you want to do some share buybacks or actually have some cash to do some acquisitions. So what's actually happening here when we look at the market? Supply and demand. When the oil price collapses, what happens? Well, the first things to go are sort of cash, share buyback, and growth. I think that's what we've heard, growth. We focus on what's going to be important for tomorrow and no longer really long term. So far, so good. Then we start to hit into dividends. Some international companies like ExxonMobil pays dividends for many, many years, and I'm invested in ExxonMobil and like my dividends. If ExxonMobil would stop paying dividends, that might be a problem. Tax. Never a good idea to default on tax. Interest is the other one. So what actually happens as the oil price goes down to this level, it will start to eat into dividends, tax, interest, and companies will go bankrupt. If companies go bankrupt, what happens? Well, their production goes away, supply diminishes, and the price goes up. This is what regulates the individual fundamentals. The issue here is that actually not only involves shareholders, but a government in this particular case. From a market perspective, we really have to look at two things. One is fundamental, supply and demand. That's what a commodity market is. There's another aspect to it. It's perception, anticipation, and speculation. I would actually contend that $140 per barrel, which we had last year, there was a lot of speculation at this particular level here. So, let's move. How good are we at predicting oil price? And we all kind of know that we're not too good at it, but I found this very interesting report for the Energy Information Administration from the US. There are many, many people involved in this, and they do this every year for a long time. In 2010, they decided to do a look back, said, well, how good are we actually? We publish these reports every year, and everybody reads them. How good are we actually at it? And as you can see in blue, this is the actual wax tested intermediate, and in red, the prediction they actually had at that time. So for a long period of time, up until 1995, systematically over-predicted where the oil price would go, systematic. Starting in 1995, systematically under-predicted. And here I'm actually picking only on one agency. There are many, many other ones. Nobody can predict the oil price. Would you agree with that? We can't. We can't. But we try it all the time, isn't it? Well, then we start to be a bit smarter, and we say, well, actually, we cannot predict the reference price, because that moves all the time. So what we're going to do now, we're going to give you a range. So what is the range in terms of oil price? So the agency predicts that. That is 2015. 2015, this is this year. What they basically predict in terms of oil price range in 2035, 2040 is between $50 per barrel and $250. How useful is that? I mean, it certainly is correct, yeah? But again, it's not really useful. I'll just point out something which is important. There is this little curve under the reference curve here which says high oil and gas resource. So somebody starts to think about a supply issue and what's happening from a supply perspective. How good are we now? We say 2040, that's really in the future. Might be dead by that time. But how about next year? Because that's kind of what is interesting as well. So let's look at the other part here. That's the short-term energy outlook. And here we are in January 2017. So the range from an oil price perspective is between $30 and $120. That's a bit more than a year's time. How useful is that? Not much. So I think what we need is a new way of thinking about oil price. And when I'm thinking a new way, we'll see what that means. So what is the oil price since 1960? I'm actually very fortunate. I've been born in 1957, so I've seen it all. Very interesting. We'll see a bit more about that. So what we actually have, it's West Texas Intermediate. I've selected West Texas Intermediate. This one is actually inflation adjusted. And look at this green line, this gray line here. This gray line represents $30 per barrel oil today, pushed back in the past. So this is sort of what I call an interesting line to look at. Also in green and red, we have supply. we have demand growth year per year, and we actually have places where demand actually dropped. So there are very few times where demand dropped, and there were actually shorter periods of time. Hold that thought. When I said a different way of thinking about it, and a new way of thinking about it, it's actually not that new. Because in 1973, when demand dropped, Shell Oil actually used scenario thinking, which is a different way about thinking about oil prices. And this is just an example which was published in 1985. Everybody agrees this is not really new, where we started to look, in this case, it's demand for energy, not trying to predict what the demand is going to be, but trying to figure out what possible scenarios we could actually have. How could it actually evolve through time with different variables? So scenario thinking is going to be, in my mind, very important looking forward. So let's a bit go through time. 1973, 1986. That's what I call the first period. And I call it the fundamentals rule. Why? Because what basically happened, I'm looking at production in the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Iran here. I've selected a few which I would call the mover and shakers in this environment. You'll see Russia coming in later. United States production pretty much flat at that time. What happens in 1973 is the Arab oil embargo. I still remember I was in Switzerland at that time. I truly enjoyed this period because we could actually rollerblade and bicycle on our interstates because every other weekend cars were not allowed to drive. So basically a drop in demand at this particular point here. And production kind of stayed flat for a period of time. Now, in 1980, something else happened, which is important. 1980, the demand dropped dramatically. Yeah? Which actually what means at this particular point in time, if demand drops, what happens to the oil price if demand drops? Well, the price tanks, yeah? It goes down. Well, so what then happened is that Saudi Arabia tried to control the oil price, it's OPEC, mainly driven by Saudi Arabia, tried to control the oil price by reducing their production dramatically. They succeeded up to a point. I mean, they've been kind of successful to keep the oil price at the level they wanted at that particular time. But at some stage, they realized this is not going to work. So what did Saudi Arabia do? If we look at the next one, Saudi Arabia increased their production dramatically. And I still remember this particular day very vividly. Why? Because that's the day I joined Royal Dutch Shell. That's where I started my career in an oil company, which was very interesting to start, life in a period like that. What then happened between 1986 and 1997 is what I call a balanced world. Oil prices were kept at a certain level. Supply and demand were balanced out. What we see, the United States are dropping in terms of production. Saudi Arabia is controlling it. Russia is dropping dramatically. But it was a balanced world. Do we have spikes in here? Yes. The first Gulf War, the oil price spiked dramatically. But this was just a spike. It's a storm, what I would call. But for a longer period of time, it was around what? $30 per barrel. Yeah? In today's terms. You have to understand that in this period, we started the deepwater exploration in the Gulf of Mexico. This is a time TLPs like Mars were actually built. So deepwater, at that time, lived in a $30 world. What I've actually heard last week is deepwater is dead. We're never going to be able to do deepwater ever again. I would like to challenge that. I think that's the part of a different way of thinking about it. What happened next? Next, we're again into a fundamentals rule world, mainly driven by demand in China in this particular case. So what we now see is the oil price spiking, 2009, dramatic drop, and then recovering, mainly driven by a demand in China in this particular time. Now, why do I stop in 2011? Because somebody could argue this just goes on until 2014, because that's when the drop actually happened. In 2011, something really fundamentally changed. And what really changed, if we look about United States, Saudi Arabia, and Russia, we actually start to see this increase in production in the United States. In a very short period of time, the United States added 3 million barrels of oil per day into the system. Well, that will actually create a drop. Was a drop created immediately? No. Let's look into detail what actually drove this. What happened from the United States production perspective here are the unconventionals. Everybody was investing in unconventionals, and by the way, this we still do. What actually did fuel the unconventionals? Well, we have to look at something. It's low interest rates. So after 2009, after the crash, the Fed actually decided to drop interest rates nearly down to zero. So borrowing money was like the easiest thing in the world. And by the way, you were exploring for unconventionals, which means that the return were fairly quick, fairly fast, so everybody would lend you money. So this actually fueled this incredible increase in production. Why did we see a delay in the price drop? Because just about at the same time, sanctions on Iran took about 1 to 1.5 million barrel equivalent per day out of the system. So we saw a delay in this. But I will actually contend, and later on, China, the Chinese economy, started to flatten out. When we say that the Chinese economy is tanking, this is not true. It's just kind of flattening out a bit, trying to find a new floor, and it will certainly increase again. So what we see in 2014, we could actually sort of perceive it before in 2011 in what actually happened with the unconventional. So the big issue was, well, for how long are these guys in the unconventional actually going to last? And what we've seen is something which actually Saudi had not predicted at all, and it's called efficiency, and the ability to increase efficiency dramatically in a very short period of time. This graph here is what I call the best efficiency I've ever seen. I'm just showing one region here, which is the Balkan. It's true for any of the other ones. The rig count dropped dramatically from 200 to maybe 75. So many rigs were taken out of the system. So you would actually say, if you take many rigs out of the system, production is going to drop dramatically. I firmly believe this is what would happen in Colombia. What we have actually seen is, no, the productivity per well, the amount produced per well, increased dramatically in this time. So what really happened is the ability just to remove the rigs which were not as efficient, the crews which were not as efficient, increase efficiency, and the result at the end is that very little oil production has been taken out of the system so far. Yeah. And this is true over all the individual plays. So break-even oil prices. We've all heard about break-even oil prices for the last six months. And I really like this cartoon from The Economist, which is Sheikh versus shale, which is the way it was portrayed, from a break-even perspective. And the break-even is different here. The break-even here is it's a fiscal break-even. It's actually to keep countries afloat. In the case of the shales in the United States, about keeping companies afloat, which is something slightly different and has a huge different impact. I've drawn here the line at $60 per barrel. So what we see is that most of the GCC countries and associates at $60 per barrel really have a problem. Currently, Saudi Arabia has a reserve of about $600 billion. They've actually announced last week that they would definitely drop all investments, new investments, infrastructure type of investments, to actually be able to succeed. So, 10 more minutes. Uncertainties and predetermined elements. So going forward, what are the uncertainties? What are we uncertain about? And I make a difference between uncertainties and predetermined elements. Uncertainties are things which haven't happened yet, and we don't know what's going to happen. It's truly uncertain. A predetermined element is something which has happened, but we don't know what the impact actually is or will be. So let's look at a few of them. US shale boom, productivity. Well, can we keep going with that productivity? Can they basically keep up? Or have they taken out most of what really, worked? US Federal Reserve's interest rate. You might have heard that, systematically over the last 6 months, the Fed actually discussed to increase interest rates. What would happen to increased interest rates? Most of these companies in the US actually will have to repay debt and actually create new debt. Will the interest rates be as good as the ones before? That's a huge question mark. This could take a lot of oil out of the system. US role as a swing producer versus Saudi, and that really is a discussion. Who is now going to be the swing producer in the future? Is it going to be Saudi, or is it actually going to be the US? Iran, I think this is a predetermined element. I mean, it's pretty clear that sanctions will be lifted against Iran, but what is the impact going to be? Is it going to be 1 million barrels per day? Is it going to be 2 million barrels per day? How long is it going to take to get up to that level? Nobody really knows. Economic development in the GCC, that is a big issue as well. Will Saudi actually at some stage say, well, we're just going to drop production because we cannot live with that type of oil price? That is something important. US oil export, this is also a predetermined element. I think Congress has decided to actually lift the ban on export. The only thing this will do is actually reduce the gap between Brent and West Texas Intermediate, which can be interesting and important as well. If we now look from a demand perspective, economic development, OECD, flat. Flat, from an oil perspective, flat. China, India, and Brazil, mainly around China. If China recovers, they will actually use an incredible amount of hydrocarbons in their system. And the very important one, which is national and global climate policies. Oil is currently perceived as the bad thing. How will actually the future president of the United States will actually kind of determine some of these policies here as well. So that could be really important. This could go really, really fast. Just last week, we were working with a Chinese national oil company, and we looked at, for England, the time at which producing electricity, the way they do it right now, and producing electricity from renewables would cross. And the answer is 2018. That is tomorrow. So in England in 2018, it might be cheaper to actually produce electricity from renewables than the classical ways. This is something we really have to watch. So, two plausible scenarios going forward. One of them, which I really think is supply-driven. So supply will win out. It's going to be a balanced world for a longer period of time. Is this a bad world? No, I think this is actually an excellent world. Remember the remark I made about the Gulf of Mexico and deep water? Because in the deep water at that time, I remember the first time we drilled an $80 million deep water well. I mean, all hell was breaking loose. We drilled Deep Mensa, $80 million. We said, this is not possible. We cannot survive. Well, last year I was discussing with a company a well they drilled in the deep water. It was $500 million. So what actually happens is that cost will come down in this world. Or we could move to a more fundamental rule type of world where demand and perception will drive everything again. So driven by demand, driven by China. So we really have to think about this in two different types of scenarios. Recommendation for EP companies. If you go out to LinkedIn, to Oil and Gas Journal, to everything, you will always see this. Looking to increase efficiency, save costs during the downturn, and then whatever company is publishing it gives you a recipe on what to do. Yeah? My point is, this is too late. It's not in the downturn that you actually look at increased efficiency, saving costs. The point I'm going to make is with the next slide, which looks at return on invested capital. Not going to go into great detail. What we have here over a period of 10 years, it's return on invested capital. If you return more than 15%, you definitely have a competitive advantage. If you're around 10%, you're returning cost of capital. If you're below zero, you know what happens. So you can actually see companies which systematically, over time, return cost of capital much higher than the 15%, and other ones which actually lag in this environment. If you want to survive in any type of environment, regardless, that's where you want to be. That is a very dangerous position here. So what we actually really need is discipline in the system. A lot of discipline in strategic growth-seeking activities, not just go and do something, really figure out what we want to invest in, and is it going to return the cost of capital and more. Otherwise, we don't do it. At a $140 world, I saw a lot of lack of discipline because just about everything would fly. But this has to be coupled with the organizational ability. These two things really have to go hand in hand. I've seen companies having wonderful strategies, but the organizational ability was not there to support the strategy, and they dramatically failed. And these are not only small companies. The company I worked for, I do have a couple of examples around that. There we go. So to end, some recommendation. I was asked to give some recommendations. Obviously, I do not have a crystal ball. One of the advantages I certainly have is that I've worked with Ecopetrol over the last 2 years. So I've kind of seen the change inside an organization. The first most important thing is to optimize the E&P sector in Colombia, and I think we've heard that before as well, for value creation. It is really important that everybody works together and tries to create value. It's not about one party winning. It's about really creating value. The government really plays its important role. The A&H, one of my recommendations is, and I know it's happening, revaluation of 18 months commitments. I'm sure a lot of companies have commitments which do not add value in the current environment. This is a matter of renegotiating. I'm not saying dropping, I'm saying renegotiating to create value, because everybody has to create value. Ecopetrol really look at the organizational ability. Ecopetrol international presence. Ecopetrol wants to be an international oil company. What kind of ability do you actually need to be able to create value in such an environment? This is absolutely critical. Major IOCs create an environment where they actually can make money, and also look at the more than 100 national independents in the country. The conversation about the future of oil price, and I've not gone into details around my two scenarios and why I carry these two scenarios, but it's important not to carry just one model in your head. Why? Because if you carry one model in your head, I can guarantee you will see a surprise.